The key was already on the counter when the registrar told me for the first time that my world did not exist. I had set it there out of habit, the way a man empties his pockets when he is asked for everything he has. Brass, palm length, 3 teeth worn round at the corners, a shank polished bright by 60 years of human hands. The registrar looked at it the way you would look at a dead insect on a clean floor. "This is not an admissible instrument," he said. His name was Tilek Sir, Junior Registrar, Window 9, Sen Interchange Transit Authority. He was Vasari, gray-skinned, narrow as a door, with 4 amber eyes stacked in pairs and a voice like paper being folded with great care. Behind him, the morning lit the concourse through sun windows 40 meters tall, and the light came down in slabs across a hall built to move 40,000 travelers a day. I was the only one of those 40,000 who had just stopped being from anywhere. "Run it again," I said. "Calm. You learn calm in my trade or you learn nothing." He ran it again. The terminal between us threw its answer up in cool blue glyphs, and he turned the display so I could read the translation strip. "Origin unverified. Registry entry does not resolve. Transit credential void." "Calder's Landing," I said. "Human agricultural colony, Calder system, 90 years settled." I was born there. My father was born there. "I have a return berth on the Spindrift Lane leaving in 6 hours." "There is no Calder's Landing in the Concord registry," Tilek Sir said. "Therefore there is no berth. Therefore there is no return." I had been in transit for 19 days by then, inbound from a 3-year soil contract on Pell's Hollow, where I had taught 200 Dravani farmers how to keep their topsoil from blowing into their own sea. 61 years old, 1 duffel, 1 tool roll, 1 key. Somewhere in the 19th day, while I slept in a transfer berth with my boots on, a polity called the Rukith Combine had filed a prior claim petition on the entire Calder system. Mineral rights, salvage title, the whole orbital shell. And the Concord, the registry authority that owns every lane, every gate, every stamp between here and home, had done what its law required. It had suspended my world's entry pending adjudication. Suspended, not disputed, not flagged. Suspended, as in lifted out of existence and held there the way you hold a name on the tip of your tongue. "My documents," I said, and laid them out. "Colonial citizenship, surveyor's license, land deed, 80 hectares, Varga homestead, South Furrow Valley." Tilek Sir passed each one under his reader, and each one came back with the same patient blue refusal, because every document I owned was a pointer to a registry entry, and the registry entry was gone. I had spent my life certifying ground, telling banks and governments what soil was real and what soil was wishful thinking. Now every certificate with my name on it pointed at a hole. That was when I put the key on the counter. The one physical object in my duffel that didn't point at anything. It simply was. Cut on Calder's Landing in my grandfather's shed, from brass that had flown between stars before I was born. "This opens the door of my house," I said. "The house is on a road. The road is in a valley. The valley is on a world. Worlds don't stop existing because a database lost a row." Tilek Sir looked at the key for a long moment. 2 of his 4 eyes blinked, out of sequence, which I would later learn was the Vasari equivalent of being quietly, deeply unsettled. "A thing that is not filed," he said, "cannot be found. A thing that cannot be found cannot be proven. I am sorry. The window is closing." The window closed. Mine, and then in a sense, all of them. Here's the shape of the trap, because it took me one afternoon to map it, and it deserves to be mapped. I could not board any outbound vessel. No verified origin, no transit credential. I could not pass the inner doors into Sen Interchange proper. Station entry requires a registered home polity to stand surety, and I could not be deported, which was the part that made one of the duty officers laugh before he caught himself, because deportation requires a destination, and I no longer had one that any system would accept. 3 doors, all lawful, all locked. What remained was the transit hall. 1,100 meters of concourse, benches, vendor stalls, and sun windows, the space between gates that belongs to no polity at all. "Residual person," the duty officer said, filling in a form. He was Vessery too, older, with a clip of rank cylinders along one shoulder. "Temporary designation. Adjudication of the Calder claim is scheduled within the standard term." "How long is the standard term?" he told me. I did the arithmetic from their calendar into mine and arrived at something between 400 days and never. "There's a human consulate on this station," I said. "There is a human consular office in the diplomatic ring," he agreed. "The diplomatic ring is inside the station. You are outside the station. They may file on your behalf. Filings join the queue." He stamped the form. The stamp came down with a sound like a knuckle on a coffin lid, and that sound was the last official thing anyone did for me for a long time. I want to be honest about the first night, because everything that came later grew out of it. I did not sleep. I sat on a bench of pale composite under sun windows gone dark with my duffel under my knees, and I held the key in my fist until the teeth printed their shape into my palm. My father gave it to me at the shuttle pad the year I took my first off-world contract. He had carried it for 40 years. His father cut it. "Keep it oiled," he said, "and come back before I'm too deaf to hear you knock." He was 4 years dead now, buried in the windbreak he planted himself, and the house was my house, and the lock was waiting, and the entire apparatus of civilized space had just informed me that none of it had ever existed. A man can do several things with that. I had watched men do most of them on 3 worlds. Rage is the common one, and rage in a transit hall gets you sedated, filed, and forgotten. So I opened my hand, looked at the key until my breathing slowed, and put it away. Then I took stock, because stock-taking is the one prayer I know. 1 duffel clothes, field boots, a sun-cracked hat, 1 tool roll, surveyor's instruments, a soil auger broken down into thirds, hand tools, a spool of wire tape, 41 Concord credits of hard script, the kind that doesn't need an origin to spend, and a credit account I could no longer touch, because accounts, too, require a verified home polity. 41 credits in a hall where a bowl of vendor noodles cost 3. The ration counter at the hall's east end turned me down on the second day. Not unkindly. The machine simply could not open a subsidy line for a man with no origin code, and the attendant around, copper-feathered being from a world I never learned, had no override and the grace to look ashamed about it. I ate 1 meal a day after that and told my stomach it was a drought year. On the 3rd day I found the fountain. There were 6 public water points in the transit hall, and 4 of them were dead. Valves scaled shut, pressure bled off, taped over with notices in 9 scripts that all meant broken. Travelers queued 11 deep at the 2 live ones. I watched the queue for an hour, then unrolled my tools on the floor beside the nearest dead fountain, pulled the access panel, and found exactly what I expected. Mineral scale, a seized valve stem, and a maintenance log that hadn't been touched in a vessel a year. It took me 2 hours. I cleaned the stem, cut a new seat gasket out of tape and patience, ground the scale off with a stone I keep for sharpening, and reassembled it. When I opened the line, the water came through cloudy, then clear, then cold. I filled my canteen and drank the first free thing the Sen Interchange had ever given me. An old vendor watched me do it from his stall across the corridor, a heavy, slow being like a walrus poured into an apron, with whiskered jowls and small, bright eyes. Hosk, his stall banner said. In script, the translation lens turned into Hosk. Hot foods, cold foods, foods. When I closed the panel, he raised 1 vast gray hand, and I raised mine, and that was the entire conversation. The next morning, there was a bowl waiting on the corner of his counter. And when I tried to pay, he turned all 400 kilos of himself around and became very busy with a kettle. I tell you about the fountain because of what happened at Window 9 that same afternoon. I had filed my first petition, Form 77K, Restoration of Origin, which I had copied out by hand from the public regulation wall because printing cost a credit a page. Telexer processed it in front of me. Denied, of course. You cannot restore an origin that is sub judice. But as he stamped it, he said, without looking up, "You repaired the fountain at Junction 4. It needed a gasket. There is a maintenance contract," he said. "The contractor is required to respond within 30 days. How long has it been 30 days? His upper eyes met mine, and his lower pair stayed on the form. And I understood I had just heard a Vessery tell a joke at his own government's expense, in the only way his job would let him. "Your denial," he said, sliding the stamp page across. "Every denial must be issued in writing, with the grounds stated. That is the law. Keep it. Why?" "Because it is yours," he said, as though the question hurt him somewhere specific. "It is the only thing this window can give you that the registry cannot take back." I folded the denial into my breast pocket, behind the key. I didn't know yet that I was beginning a collection, or that the gray clerk at Window 9, who blinked out of sequence and despised dead fountains, would turn out to matter more to the existence of my world than any fleet my species ever launched. I only knew that the light through the sun windows had gone the color of late afternoon on a planet I could no longer prove, and that a man with 1 key, 1 tool roll, and 38 credits had better start treating survival as a trade. So I did what surveyors do on bad ground. I stopped arguing with the map, and I started walking the terrain. Adjudicator Corin Mauve found me on the 9th day, which I later understood was fast. The Cent Interchange processed 500,000 sentients a year through its dispute offices, and a full adjudicator did not ordinarily descend to the transit hall to inspect 1 stranded human. He came with 2 clerks and a recording drone, and he stopped in front of my bench as though it were an exhibit. "The residual person," he said. He was Vasari like Tilek, but built broader, with 6-rank cylinders and the brisk warmth of a tax notice. "Varga Elias, surveyor unemployed, origin unverified, origin suspended," I said. "There's a difference, and your own form says so." Section 4. The recording drone tilted. Corin Mauve's lower eyes narrowed while his upper pair stayed perfectly pleasant. And I filed that expression away for the rest of my stay. A Vasari running 2 faces at once. "You are owed accuracy," he said. "Origin suspended. My office manages the hall's census. You will be pleased to know I have found you an exit." He gestured down the concourse toward the inner wall, where a door stood between two columns with a blue light burning over it. Door 12. "The consular annex. Your species maintains an office in the diplomatic ring. I have arranged a corridor pass. Walk through, present yourself, and you become your consulate's problem instead of the Concord's. They feed their own. You would sleep in a bed." It was a good trap. I want to credit it properly. It was clean, kind-faced, and lawful on its surface, and a man 9 days hungry, sleeping on composite, was supposed to take it at a run. "That door is an entry point to the station proper," I said. "I cross it without a registered origin. I'm an unlawful entrant. Unlawful entrants are transferable. Who holds the transfer contract for the Sen interchange these days?" "The contract is held by a licensed remand service," Korenmov said smoothly. "Owned by?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Hosk had told me on the 6th day, between bowls, in his slow, boulder-rolling voice, the remand service was a Rukith Combine subsidiary, and stranded debtors who crossed the wrong line at Sen had a way of finishing their journeys in Combine labor processing, where the paperwork was flawless, and the people never came back to complain about it. The same Combine whose claim had erased my world had positioned itself to collect me the moment I stepped out of the hall that the law had locked me into. There was a tidiness to it I almost admired. Almost. "I'll stay where the law put me," I said. "But thank you for the corridor pass. File it somewhere it can be found." The pleasant upper eyes stopped being pleasant. For a moment the adjudicator looked at me the way Tillixer had looked at the key, a thing on the counter that refused to fit a category, and then he turned with his clerks and his drone and went back through door 12, and the blue light swallowed him. That night I moved my bench, not far, 30 meters, to the foot of the Great Eastern Sun windows, where the maintenance gantries came down to the floor. I had spent 9 days studying the hall the way I'd study a watershed, and what I had found was this. The transit hall was dying of neglect on purpose. Dead fountains. Vendor stalls taxed for light they no longer received, because the sun shutters, the immense louvered blades that managed the window's glare, had frozen years ago, a third of them stuck closed. Benches snapped and never replaced. The Concord starved the hall because the hall generated no revenue, and everything that broke stayed broken, and everyone stranded in it learned to live in the gloom of a place that had given up. I am an old man from a dry valley, and I know exactly one sermon, and it is this: you fix the water first, then the light, then the soil, and you do not wait for permission from people who are not coming. The shutters took me 6 days. The drive motors were fine, Vesuri built well, but the control linkages had scaled up in the dry station air exactly like the fountain valve, and somebody had looped the fault circuit into a maintenance queue that no longer had a contractor on the end of it. I walked the gantries at night with my tool roll, freed one linkage at a time, cleaned, greased with cooking fat from husk rendered down and filtered through cloth, and rebalanced the blades by hand. On the 6th morning I cranked the eastern bank open, and the dawn-side light of Sen's star came down into the transit hall in one slow golden avalanche, and 1,100 meters of stranded, queuing, exhausted travelers looked up at the same time. Somewhere down the concourse, a child made a sound I didn't need the lens to translate. Hosk's bowl was bigger that day. By the end of the week, the flour seller from the kiosk by Junction 2 had stopped wilting half her stock and quietly stopped charging me for tea. The cobbler 2 stalls down sent his daughter over with a stool he'd built from crate slats, because he had seen me sleeping sitting up. None of them asked what I was. The transit hall ran on 9 scripts and no shared grammar, but a man who returns the light gets read correctly in all of them. Tillixer said nothing about the shutters for 3 days. On the 4th, processing my next denial, Form 81C, petition for interim travel document, denied ground state in writing, he paused with the stamp in the air. "The eastern shutters," he said. "The light reaches window 9 in the morning now. It did not before. Scale in the linkages. Same disease as your fountains." "There was a contract," he began and stopped himself, because we both knew the joke now, and it had stopped being funny to him. He stamped the denial. Then, in the strip of counter between us, careful as a man laying down a card he isn't sure he's allowed to play, he said, "What does it open?" "The brass instrument. You carry it on your person. Every time you stand at this window, your hand checks it. It is a key. Keys open." It was the first question anyone at the Sen Interchange had asked me about myself that wasn't printed on a form. "A door," I said. "Farmhouse door. Hill country, South Furrow Valley, Calder's Landing. Timber frame my grandfather raised. Stone footing, green roof you can see from the Ridge Road. The door's the original, so's the lock." I turned the key over in my fingers, and the worn brass caught the new morning light coming down through the shutters I'd freed. And it opens one more thing. There's a vault under the east barn. Seed vault. Every cultivar my family's grown for 3 generations. Drought wheat, cold barley. The apple stock my grandmother bred that fruits in a 30-day summer, 2,000 lines. Same key fits both locks. My grandfather cut it that way on purpose, so a man would have to be able to get into his house before he could get into the future. Tilexer's 4 eyes had gone very still, all of them on the key. On my world, he said slowly, a thing is real when it is filed. We are taught this before we are taught our names. The file is the thing. The thing is only evidence of the file. His lower eyes blinked, out of order. Your world is a suspended row in a registry, and yet you stand in this hall and you carry the file for 2,000 kinds of grain in your pocket, made of metal with teeth.
It's not a file, I said. It's a promise.
Different technology entirely. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the queue forming behind me, and the window's chime sounded, and the Concord swallowed him again the way it swallowed everything. But I had seen it, the flicker, the hairline crack in a lifetime of doctrine. The alien carried that crack home with him that night. I'd watched it leave with him, riding his narrow gray shoulders like a sparrow. The human consulate reached me in the 5th week by relay, through a public terminal that charged by the minute. The consular officer's name was Mara Okafor, and her face in the flickering pain had the particular tiredness of someone fighting paper with paper. Mr. Varga, you're the surveyor. Not a question. There are 940 human nationals of Calder's Landing currently stranded in transit across Concord space. You're the only one stuck in a hall the Combine has a collection contract on, so you get my personal attention. I need you to listen carefully, because the next part is going to make you angry, and I need you not to be. I've had 5 weeks of practice. Earth knows, she said. Earth has known since the hour the claim was filed. The Secretariat has the Calder case on its priority docket, and there are exactly 2 ways this goes. The first way, we lose patience. We send ships, and we have the ships, Mr. Varga. Never doubt it. And we park them over the Seine interchange and demand our people and our planet back. And the moment we do, the Combine's advocates stand up in front of the Concord and invoke the coercion clause. Any registry claim pressed under armed demonstration is voided and reassigned. They erased the registry and then built a trap where our strength springs it. They are praying for our fleet, Mr. Varga. The fleet is the trap. I sat with that. On the pain, Okafor watched me sit with it, and something in her face said I'd passed a small test by not shouting. And the second way is we beat them inside the law they chose, she said. Adjudication. The Concord requires the Combine to prove their prior claim, and they've manufactured 90 years of mining beacons and salvage filings, all digital, all backdated, all very beautiful. To answer it, we have to prove continuous human habitation of Calder's Landing from first landing to now. And here is the problem I am paid to say out loud. Every record of your colony that lived on a Concord relay has been corrupted or erased. We have Earthside duplicates, and Combine advocates will argue Earthside records are partisan instruments. What the tribunal credits is primary artifacts, physicals objects, contemporaneous with the founding, bearing verifiable provenance. 90-year-old things, Mr. Varga, that can be held in the hand and assayed in a lab, and that no one can claim were typed up last week. And Earth's copies of those are 11 jump lanes away through contested space. With the convoy clearance itself stuck in a queue, the Combine keeps objecting into next year. She rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. We will get there. Human beings have never once in our history lost a fight against a filing cabinet. But I won't lie to you about the term. Hold your ground, stay lawful, stay alive. You are at present the only human being inside that adjudication's jurisdiction, and I cannot tell you yet what that's worth. But in my experience, it is always eventually worth something. The pain died on my last quarter credit. I sat in the booth a while, listening to the hall, the cue chimes, 9 scripts of argument and lullaby, water running in a fountain I'd brought back from the dead, and my hand did the thing Tilexer had noticed before I ever did. It checked the key. Primary artifact, she'd said. Contemporaneous with the founding, holdable, assayable. I didn't see it yet. That's the truth, and I'll own it. I carried the answer against my chest for 5 weeks and didn't see it, because to me it had never been evidence of anything except a door and the man who'd told me to come back through it. But the ground had started moving that night the way it does in my trade, slowly, under instruments, long before anything you'd call a landslide. The Combine's advocate arrived at Seine on the 61st day, with the adjudication's opening session, and after that nothing moved slowly at all. The transit hall watched the adjudication open on the public panes above Junction 3, because the hall watched everything above Junction 3. Sports, weather on worlds none of us could reach, and now the legal erasure of mine. The tribunal sat in the Concord ring, 3 adjudicators superior on a bench of white stone, and before them stood the Combine's advocate, and I will describe him exactly once, because once is what he deserves. His name was Sev. He was Rukith, tall, plated in dark chitin polished like a boardroom table. With a voice the translation lens rendered as flawless, bottomless courtesy. He wore the Combine's sigil on a chain, and he opened the Calder case by expressing his client's deep sympathy for the displaced. His word, displaced, as if a database column and not his employer had done the displacing. And then he spent 2 hours assembling my world's non-existence out of perfect gleaming parts. Survey beacons in the Calder system's belt, Combine registered, with telemetry archives going back 92 years. Salvage filings on derelict tonnage, mineral assay claims renewed on schedule decade over decade. All of it digital, all of it notarized, all of it. I knew with a certainty I could not yet prove, manufactured in the last 2 years and backdated by people who were very good at it. And against it, where the colony's own registry threads should have answered, the Concord's relays returned corruption, gaps, checksum failures. 9 decades of births, deeds, harvests, and weather logs rotted out of the record with surgical patience. The Combine does not assert that no humans are present in the Calder system. Sev told the bench, gently, the way you'd correct a child. Squatters arrive. Squatters persist. The Combine asserts that no lawful settlement was ever instantiated. What my respected human colleagues offer in answer is data, and data, esteemed adjudicators, is testimony. It speaks, however, its custodian instructs. If the human claim is true, it is a physical truth, and physical truth leaves physical residue. Let them produce it, an object, one object, contemporaneous with this alleged founding, bearing provenance my assayers may test. He spread his polished hands the soul of reasonableness. Surely 90 years of civilization left behind one thing. The bench took it under advisement and issued the interim finding that evening. The hall's panes carried it in 9 scripts, and Tilek Sir, at my shoulder in the crowd, off shift, in the gray civilian wrap that made him look like a folded umbrella, read it aloud anyway, in his careful paper voice, as if saying it gently could soften what it was. Claim of settlement, digitally instantiated, physically unverified. Claimant parties granted 120 days to produce primary artifact evidence. Absent such production, the prior claim of the Rukath Combine shall perfect, their phrase for it. On the 121st day, the theft would become flawless. Your consulate's convoy, Tilek said quietly, the one carrying your Earth records, cleared the queue last week. 11 lanes out, escorted, moving. I'd had one more relay call from Okafor, 40 seconds of it. Combines objected to its routing twice already. She thinks they'll hold it short of send until the term lapses. So do I. That would be obstruction. That would be scheduling, I said. Ask me how I know the difference. His eyes did their out-of-sequence blink. Around us the crowd was dispersing into the gold evening light of the shutters I'd open, and I watched him stand there doing arithmetic against his own upbringing. A thing is real when it is filed. He had believed it the way I believe in rain, and he had just watched a filing system, the holiest machine his species ever built, being used as a weapon to disappear a world with people on it, and the machine had no objection, because machines never do. The crack I'd seen at window 9 was widening, and I did the kindest thing I could, which was not to watch. I'd like to tell you the next 80 days slowly, but they didn't happen slowly, so you'll get them the way the hall got them. I fixed the other 3 fountains. I rebuilt 11 benches with the cobbler's crate-slat lumber and a bag of salvage fasteners, and when Koronamav's census clerks came around to inventory unauthorized improvements, the flower seller stood in front of the benches with her arms crossed and produced, because I'd written it for her, a citation of the transit authorities' own furnishing standard, which the benches now exceeded and the authorities' neglected stock did not. The clerks went away. The benches stayed. So did the citation, posted on the regulation wall, where I had begun to spend my evenings the way other stranded men spent theirs at the liquor kiosk. Because here is what I'd learned by the 70th day, working through the public volumes one bound code at a time. Concord law was not a wall. It was a watershed. 10,000 years of accumulated statute from 40-member species, channel cut over channel, oxbows of dead rule left stranded when the living current moved, and nobody walked the whole terrain anymore. They navigated by the digital index, and the digital index, like all indexes, only answered questions someone had thought to ask it. A surveyor doesn't trust the index. A surveyor walks the ground. I walked it for the Drev family first. 11 of them, 3 generations, strand 4 months over a guarantor seal that had expired in transit, and their molting daughter needed humidity the hall didn't have. And the renewal queue ran 9 weeks. I found their answer in an emergency conveyance rule written 600 years ago for a plague evacuation and never repealed. A minor and documented physiological distress confers automatic guarantor status on the nearest kin adult for the duration of transit. Tilek Sir read my handwritten citation at window 9, looked up the dead rule, found it living, and stamped 11 transit documents in a row while the Drev patriarch wept through both sets of nostrils. They left on the next lane ship. The daughter pressed her thumb to my palm at the gate, which among Dravani is for family. After that, the hall brought me its broken paper the way it had brought me its broken water. A Pelian student trapped by a transcription error between two romanizations of his own name. A widow whose husband's remains the cargo rules would ship home but whose grief the passenger rules wouldn't. Two musicians, an apprentice welder, a deaf old pilgrim. I won some and lost some, and I charged nothing, and I wrote every petition by hand at a vendor table in the morning light, and the queue at my bench got long enough that Hosk built it a rope. I know what it looks like from outside. The stranded man finds purpose, the hall becomes a family, and the days pass warm. But understand what it was from inside. It was reconnaissance. Every petition I wrote taught me another channel of the watershed. Every dead rule I found alive told me the same thing, over and over, in statute after statute, like a vein of ore running under a whole mountain range. This law had been written by beings who once knew that the world is made of things, not records, and had forgotten it so gradually that the things law was all still there, buried, waiting, never repealed. Somewhere in that mountain was the channel that connected a brass key to a tribunal. I didn't know its name yet, but I had stopped doubting it existed, and I dug with both hands. Korenmov escalated in the 83rd day's small hours because his kind always comes at night. A removal notice posted on my bench while I slept on it. The residual person E. Varga, having engaged in unlicensed advocacy, unlicensed repair, and unlicensed commerce, the bowls, they'd counted Hosk's bowls, was declared a disruption to hall order, subject to administrative relocation to a combined serviced remand facility within 10 days unless cause shown. Cause shown. 2 words of bureaucratic mercy left in the notice like a key under a mat, not out of kindness. The law required it, and he was too careful a man to skip a required step. He was counting on me to have no cause a Vasari tribunal would credit. I read the notice twice in the dawn light. Then I folded it into my breast pocket with the denials. I had 19 denials by then. Everyone stamped, everyone ground-stated, everyone mine, and I walked to Hosk's stall, and I asked him a question I had been a coward about for 83 days. The hall's people, the vendors, the long-stranded, how many would put their name on a paper for me? Hosk turned his great whiskered head and looked down the concourse, at the benches, the fountains, the light coming gold through the eastern windows onto 1,100 meters of the Concord's forgotten floor. All of them, he said, every stall, every bench. You fixed the water, Varga. He said it like a fact of geology. I wrote my paper, but not about the water, and not about cause shown, or not only, because at the bottom of the 83rd day, an old rule had finally surfaced from the watershed with the mud still on it in a bound appendix of the registry code so untouched its pages cracked, and I had read it 4 times to be sure I wasn't dreaming it, and I had copied it out in pencil in a hand that shook on the last line. Reciprocal deposit. Upon instantiation of any settlement claim, the claimant polity shall lodge with the Concord Registry a physical claim instrument, sealed and indexed by claim designation, to be held in the deep annex of the registry vault in perpetuity. The digital registry entry constitutes a pointer to the deposited instrument. In any conflict between record and instrument, the instrument prevails. The instrument prevails. Written when the Concord was young and its members still remembered fire and flood, never repealed, only forgotten, because for 10,000 years no one had needed paper to beat the index. Somewhere in the deep annex of the registry vault, if the founders of Calder's Landing had done what the law of their day required, there was a sealed physical claim slip with my world's name on it. 90 years old, contemporaneous with the founding, holdable, assayable, the one object Sev had dared us to produce, sleeping in the basement of the very institution that had erased us. One problem, and it was the kind that kills. The deep annex held 2 billion sealed instruments, indexed by claim designation, a retrieval code assigned at filing 90 years ago, recorded in exactly one place, the digital registry, the row that no longer resolved. The Combine hadn't needed to burn the vault. They'd only needed to burn the address. I sat at the vendor table with my pencil copy of the dead rule, and the hall went on around me, and I reached into my pocket the way I had 10,000 times, and my thumb found the worn brass teeth of the only address my family had ever needed, me to keep. And on the 83rd day, at last, like a man finally reading the survey stake he'd been leaning on, I turned the key to the light and actually looked, at what my grandfather had stamped along the shank. I had always known the marks were there. That's the bitter comedy of it. A child traces every scratch on a thing his father guards. An old man stops seeing the thing at all. Along the shank of the key between the shoulder and the bow, my grandfather had stamped 2 lines of characters with a letter punch, each strike a little uneven, the way hand stamping always is. I had spent 60 years assuming they were what they looked like. A maker's habit, a date, the kind of mark a careful man leaves on his work. In the gold morning light of the transit hall, with my pencil copy of the reciprocal deposit rule flattened on the table beside it, I read my own key like a document for the first time in my life. The first line was the survey datum. I knew at the instant I understood I was looking at coordinates and not decoration, because I had used that datum my whole working life. The foundation benchmark of Calder's Landing, the 0 point from which every deed, every field boundary, every road on my world was measured. First thing the founders fixed, before they raised a single roof. My grandfather had been 19 years old, a chainman on the founding survey crew, the day they drove that benchmark into bedrock above the South Furrow. The second line read, Call Homestead Grant, Instrument 7741K, Year 1. Instrument, not serial number, not lot number. Instrument, the word the dead rule used. And under my breastbone, where a man keeps the things he can't yet say aloud, 90 years of family habit reassembled itself into what it had been all along. The founders of Calder's Landing had lodged their claim instruments with the Concord, exactly as the law of their day required, and then, because they were the kind of people who crossed 40 light years to farm, they had not trusted the index to remember the address. They'd brought the designation home, stamped it into the brass of the landing ship's own salvaged fittings, every founding family's door key cut, from the long furrows hull bronze, my father used to say it the way other men say grace, and handed it down, hand to hand, oiled and carried and never explained, because by the second generation, it didn't need explaining, and by the third, nobody remembered there was anything to explain. The Combine had burned the address out of the registry. The address had spent 90 years riding in human pockets. I did not run to window 9. I want that on the record, whatever record finally holds all this. I sat for 10 full minutes with my hand flat over the key, doing what surveyors do, which is check the work. The stamped datum against the datum in my own field license. The designation format against the format in the appendix volume. The dates, the metal. Then I rolled the rule copy and the key into my breast pocket, stood up into the morning, and walked the 1,100 meters to window 9 at the pace of a man going to church, not a fire. Tilek Sir read my handwritten petition first. Request for registrar's inspection of a physical instrument, and his upper eyes came up slowly. There is no current procedure for this. There's a procedure, I said. Registry Code, Appendix 19, Inspection Duties of the Window Registrar. A registrar presented with a physical instrument in the course of a petition shall examine it and transcribe its markings into the window log. Shall, not may. It's never been repealed. It's just never been asked for. He was quiet a moment. Appendix 19 is paper era. So am I. I laid the key on the counter for the second time in my life, and Tilek Sir, Junior Registrar, window 9, who on my first day had looked at it like a dead insect, bent over it with a jeweler's lens from his drawer and the absolute, ceremonial attention his species reserves for filing, and he transcribed every stamped character into the window log by hand, letter by letter, checking each one against the brass twice. Datum line, instrument line, SL7741K. He recorded the metal's color, the wear pattern, the tooth count. He did it, I understood later. Not only because the dead rule said shall, but because somewhere in the last 100 days this gray, careful being had decided that if the file is the thing, then the thing on his counter deserved the most honest file he knew how to make. It is logged, he said at last, and his voice had something in it I hadn't heard from a Vasari before. Window 9, day stamp, my seal. Whatever else occurs, Elias Varga, this now exists. It is in the record of this authority that this instrument exists and bears this designation. That cannot be unfiled. Then I need one more thing, I said, the referral. He went still. He knew the rule I meant. I'd watched him find it himself in the appendix volume I'd left open on the counter, the way you leave a gate open for a horse that has been fenced too long. Registrar's referral. Any registrar who, in the course of his duties, acquires reason to believe a deposited instrument relevant to an active adjudication exists in the registry vault shall notify the curators of the deep annex directly, not through his section chief, not through the adjudicator who managed his hall. A duty wired straight from the bottom of the Concord to its oldest basement by founders who had apparently understood exactly what middle layers do to inconvenient truths. Korenmov reviews all vault correspondence from this section, Tilek said quietly, by standing order. Is his standing order older than Appendix 19? His lower eyes blinked out of sequence twice. Nothing, he said, is older than Appendix 19. And he began very carefully to write. Korenmov came down on us before the referral cleared the queue. I have wondered since which clerk sold us the half-day. It doesn't matter now. He arrived at window 9 with 4 hall wardens and the recording drone, while I stood at the counter and the key still lay between Tilek's careful hands, and he did the cleanest, cruelest lawful thing available to him. That object, he said, is unverified material of unestablished provenance, presented in connection with an active adjudication, pending review, It is taken into administrative custody. He produced the form already filled. He had only to date it. You will be issued a receipt. The hall had gone quiet around us in that way crowds do when they smell weather. I looked at the four wardens, and at the drone recording my face for any flicker they could file as disruption. And I want to tell you the truth. For one breath, the man who had kept his hands open for 100 days considered closing them. It passes. You let it pass. 61 years teaches you that much, even before 100 days in a hall teaches you the rest. I took the key from the counter. Tilek's hands withdrew from it the way you'd step back from a grave, and I set it in the padded tray myself, so that no one could ever write that it was seized. Log the chain of custody, I said to Corin Mauve level. Evidence code, sealed container, 2 witnesses, condition photographs. If a single tooth of that key carries a new scratch at review, I'll have the form that did it. You are owed accuracy, he said, his old line. Returned to me with the faintest bow, and for a moment his upper eyes were almost honest. You should have walked through door 12, surveyor. It would have been gentler. Gentler than what? Than the next 10 days, he said, and dated the form. The receipt they issued me was Form 12Q, Administrative Custody of Material. I folded it into my breast pocket where the key had ridden for 100 days, and the pocket's lightness was a wound I declined to show anyone. Around me, the hall stayed silent until the wardens were gone. And then it made a sound I had never heard it make, a low, multilingual, 9-scripted murmur that needed no translation lens at all. The flower seller was the first to cross the line. She walked to window 9, took my petition pen from the counter, and signed the cause-shown paper that Hosk had been circulating stall to stall since dawn. By nightfall, it carried 214 names. I sat on a bench I'd built, in a hall I'd lit, beside a fountain I'd raised from the dead, and I held a receipt where my grandfather's key should have been, and 10 days remained on my removal clock, and the referral sat in a queue that Corin Mauve was even then working to bury. A reasonable man would have called the position desperate, but I had spent 100 days learning the one thing about the Concord that the Combine, for all its polish, had never understood from inside. They thought the law was a machine for making things disappear. They had only ever used it that way. But the law was a watershed, and water remembers every channel it has ever cut, and somewhere below all of us, in the deep annex where the Concord kept its oldest promises, a sealed paper instrument lay in the dark with my world's name on it, waiting for one honest clerk's referral to come downstairs and ask. Tilek Sir finished his shift that night, filed his window log with his seal on the transcription, and did not go home. I know because Hosk fed him at the stall at an hour when no viscera eats, and because the next morning, when everything began to break open at once, the referral was no longer in Corin Mauve's queue. It was in the curator's. I learned afterward how he did it, and it was so simple and so entirely Tilek that I have laughed about it at odd hours ever since. He did not fight Corin Mauve's standing order. He did not argue, leak, or sneak. He read the registrar's referral rule one more time, noted that it said notify the curators directly, noted that the Concord had operated for 10,000 years, and that the rule predated electronic cues entirely, and concluded, with the flawless literal-mindedness of a being raised to believe the file is the thing, that the lawful form of direct notification was the original one. He wrote the referral out by hand, on paper, with his window seal pressed into wax he had to buy from the flower seller because no office in the section stocked it anymore. Then he rode the freight lifts down through 19 levels of the registry stack on his rest day, in his gray civilian wrap, and he knocked on the door of the deep annex like a man calling on a neighbor, and he handed the Concord's oldest institution a sealed paper document for the first time in living memory. The curators, I am told, passed it around in silence for some time. There are beings you meet only at the bottoms of institutions, the way there are fish you meet only at the bottoms of oceans. The curators of the deep annex were Vessery, most of them, but Vessery of a different era's temperament, slow, vast in their patience, keepers of 2 billion sealed promises in climate-controlled dark, whose entire doctrine was the one sentence the rest of the Concord had forgotten. In any conflict between record and instrument, the instrument prevails. For 10,000 years, the surface had sent them nothing but storage. Now a junior registrar from a transit window stood in their doorway with wax on a referral and reason to believe, and the designation SL7741 transcribed twice, letter by letter, from the shank of a brass key. Their reply reached window 9 the next morning through the official queue, where Corin Mauve could read it but not touch it, because curator correspondence outranked every adjudicator on the station. I have the wording by heart. Designation cell 7741 conforms to Year 1 human sector deposit format. Manual retrieval of the instrument is initiated. The annex reminds all parties that retrieval is a physical process and will take the time it takes. The annex reminds all parties. Hosk had that line painted on the side of his kettle before the week was out. Korenmov did what cornered procedure always does. He accelerated. My removal hearing, set for the 10th day, was moved to the 4th. Emergency hall order grounds, signed by himself, reviewed by himself. The notice reached my bench at dawn, and by mid-morning the transit hall had organized itself around me with a speed that suggested everyone but me had been preparing for it. The hearing was held in the hall's own annex chamber, a day-lit room off Junction 2, with a magistrate's desk and benches for 30. 200 and more came. They stood along the walls and out the door. Vendors who'd closed their stalls for the first hour anyone could remember. The cobbler and his daughter, the copper-feathered ration attendant, the deaf pilgrim, the widow, 3 of the wardens who were supposed to be securing the room and had elected to do so from inside it, shoulder to the wall, conspicuously off-duty. The magistrate was an elderly sken with drooping ear fans and the expression of a being who had presided over 40 years of cargo disputes and could smell history ruining a perfectly quiet docket. Korenmov presented his case with genuine skill. Unlicensed advocacy, 41 petitions drafted by a person of no standing, unlicensed repair, interference with authority infrastructure, the fountains, the shutters, the benches itemized, unlicensed commerce, the bowls. Disruption of hall order, evidenced by this very crowd, a residual person, he concluded, who had made himself the unelected mayor of a space that the law intended to be no one's, and who should be relocated before the adjudication's final phase for the integrity of the process itself. Then it was mine, and I stood up with my breast pocket full of paper and did the only thing I had ever done at the Seine interchange. I read the ground back to the people who owned it. Cause shown, I said. First cause, the law of this hall requires the authority to maintain water, light, and seating, and for 6 years it did not. And the law does not punish a man for performing the Concord's own published duty when the Concord defaults. I cite the furnishing standard. I cite the water standard. The repairs aren't my crime. They're your evidence of breach. The magistrate's ear fans came up slightly. Second cause, every petition I drafted was filed under the petitioner's own name and seal, as the code permits any literate being to do for another without fee. The code says without fee. There was never a fee. A pause. There were bowls. If the authority wishes to criminalize an old man being fed by his neighbors, I'd ask it to draft that statute in public in daylight, in front of these particular neighbors, and see how the vote goes. Somebody laughed, one of the wardens, I think, and strangled it. Third cause. I took the folder Hosk had guarded all week and set it on the magistrate's desk. 214 sworn attestations, everyone from a registered transient or licensed vendor of this hall, each one stating the same fact, that I have been continuously present, continuously peaceful, and continuously of service in this concourse for 106 days. Honored magistrate, my world has been ruled physically unverified. Very well. I am at this hour the single most thoroughly verified physical fact in the Seine interchange. The authority that cannot produce a maintenance contractor in 6 years has produced 214 witnesses to me in 5 days. I'd call that an irony, but my counsel here, I nodded at the empty chair beside me, advises me to call it a record. The magistrate's ear fans were fully raised now. Korenmov started to speak, and the old skin silenced him with one lifted digit and turned a long look on me. And fourth cause, she said. Your notice lists a fourth. Fourth cause, I said. As of yesterday, I am the registered object custodian of material under active curator retrieval, designation SL7741K. Concord Evidence Code requires the custodian of record to remain within the issuing jurisdiction until review concludes. The adjudicator's own custody form 12Q names me. He filled it in himself. I watched him date it. I laid my receipt, the wound that had ridden 100 days where the key should have been, on the desk beside the attestations. The authority is welcome to relocate me, honored magistrate, the moment it explains to the deep annex why it shipped their custodian to a combine, remand facility in mid-retrieval. The chamber was very quiet. The magistrate read Form 12Q twice, and then she looked at Korenmov with the weariness of 40 years of cargo dockets, and she said the sentence that the transit hall would repeat in 9 scripts for the rest of my stay. Adjudicator, it appears you have filed this person into existence. Removal is stayed. We are adjourned. Sev came to see me that evening. He came alone without drones, which told me everything about how the retrieval was landing in the combines. Projections. He stood at my bench in the gold shutter light with his polished chiton throwing back the sunset, and he was courteous, and he was direct. And I will say this for him, he did not insult me with a small number. Personal origin verification, restored within days, through channels his clients maintained. Compensation for my detention, he named a figure that would have bought the South Furrow Valley twice. First-class passage to Earth, or to any world I cared to name. In exchange, my withdrawal as custodian, Assignment of the instrument claimed to combine stewardship for what he called consolidated review, and my signature on a statement that the key markings were decorative family custom of no documentary intent. "You are one man," he said, not unkindly, holding a brass trinket against a body that files 10,000 instruments a day. "Your world, even if it returns to the registry, returns poor, remote, and 90 years behind. You, however, could return rich. The difference between those outcomes is a signature. My clients asked me to observe that humans are famously practical." I looked at him for a while. Down the concourse, Hosk's kettle was lit, and the flower seller was closing her kiosk, and the water was running in all 6 fountains. "We are practical," I said. "That's the part your clients keep getting wrong about what that word means. A practical man knows what a thing is for. That key is for opening my door. It's not for sale, the same way my hand's not for sale, not because it's sacred advocate, but because it's attached." "Everything detaches," Sev said softly, "at the correct price. Then your clients should have priced the curators," I said, before they burned the index to a vault full of paper. For one instant, the courtesy cracked, and I saw the thing behind it, not anger. Calculation, rebalancing its speed, a ledger discovering a column it had never been told existed. Then the polish closed over it, and he wished me a pleasant evening with perfect grace and walked back toward door 12, and I watched the blue light take him and understood that the combine had just moved from buying the future to renting time. 3 days later, the panes above Junction 3 lit with an emergency notice of session, and at the bottom of it, in the curator's archaic formal script that half the hall's translation lenses choked on, one line, "The instrument is found. The instrument will attend. Not will be produced, not will be entered into evidence. Will attend, like a witness, like an elder. Like the oldest living thing in the family, coming up from the dark of the basement, asking who had dared to say its children never existed." The combine made one more move before the session, and because it never appeared in any tribunal record, I will set it down here, so that somewhere outside the memories of a transit hall, it is written what was tried. 2 nights before the instrument was due to attend, at the dead hour when the sun windows stood black and the hall ran on pilot lighting, 4 agents of the licensed remand service came through door 12 with a transfer warrant. Not a concord warrant, a judgment from a combine commercial court, naming me as debtor in a freight dispute I had supposedly lost in absentia, on a world I had never visited, over a cargo I had never shipped. The sum was modest, the remedy was not. Custodial transfer of the debtor's person for labor settlement, executable in any jurisdiction that recognized combine commercial paper. It was their oldest trick, the one Hosk had warned me about on the 6th day, dressed in fresh forms and timed for the one window when the hall was supposed to be asleep. The hall was not asleep. The hall had not truly slept since the key went into the evidence drawer. I woke to the flower seller's hand on my shoulder and her other hand, signing quiet. And by the time the 4 agents reached my bench, there was no one on it, and the corridor they had walked in through had quietly filled behind them. Hosk stood in the middle of it with his apron still on, a kettle in one hand, and he was not blocking anything. No one was blocking anything. 200 beings were simply present, at the dead hour, awake, watching, each one holding a writing implement and a blank attestation form. The cobbler's daughter went stall to stall ahead of the agents wherever they turned, switching the corridor lighting up to full day. And at the head of it all, at his closed window, in full uniform 19 levels above his pay grade and 4 hours before his shift, stood Tilek Sir, who had been notified. I never learned by whom, and he never learned by whom. And the hall has 9 scripts and no informants, and who had brought with him the only weapon his species ever carries. The applicable rule, read aloud. He read it from the counter of window 9 in his careful paper voice while the agent stood in a corridor of 200 witnesses in full daylight at midnight. The magistrate's stay, in force until adjudication concluded, suspending all removal of the person Ivarga from any cause by any party in any paper's name, and then because he was Tilek, the evidence code's custodian clause, and then because he was Tilek, the criminal statute on interference with the tribunal's custodian, with its penalty schedule, recited in full, including the parts that applied to licensed services and the parts that applied to those who hired them. The agent's leader examined the corridor, the witnesses, the forms, the daylight someone had wired the shutters to throw at midnight. He examined his warrant, which was real and worthless. He was a professional. I will grant the combine that they hire professionals. He folded the warrant, nodded once, with something that was almost respect, to the gray clerk at the closed window, and led his team back through door 12, and the blue light took them, and the hall let out its breath in 9 languages at once. The next morning, the magistrate, informed by no one officially and by everyone in fact, entered an addendum to her stay, copied to the bench, to the curators, and to the consulate, noting an attempted execution against a tribunal custodian and reserving the question of contempt. Sev, I am told, was seen in the Concord ring that day moving at a pace no Rukith advocate has ever previously been observed to attain, and whatever he said to whoever had ordered the night's work, no combine paper ever touched my name again. The hall did not celebrate. The hall made breakfast. The flower seller put a sprig of something blue on my bench. Hosk's bowl was no larger and no smaller than usual, and the day proceeded, because the deepest thing I ever learned in that 1100 meters is that ordinary kindness, continued without interruption, is what a fortress looks like from inside. 2 nights later, the instrument attended. They held the session in the Concord Ring's grand chamber, and for the first time in 111 days, I passed through door 12, under escort as custodian of record with a curator on either side of me like 2 gray standing stones, and Corin Mauve walking behind in a silence I chose not to enjoy. The chamber was everything the transit hall was not. White stone, high glass, the light of Sin's star falling clean through a crystal roof onto the tribunal bench. The vestry build their courtrooms like greenhouses. They believe deliberation should happen in full sun, where testimony has nowhere to put a shadow. For once, their doctrine and mine agreed. Sev rose first, because of course he did, and spent the morning trying to keep the basement closed. The motion to exclude was a masterpiece, and I say that as a man who has spent 100 days learning to read their law, the retrieval was procedurally tainted, initiated by a junior registrar acting outside his section's correspondence protocols. The reference designation derived from an unverified object held in administrative custody, currently under provenance challenge. The deep annex itself, he argued, and here even the bench stirred, operated under deposit-era rules never harmonized with modern evidentiary code, and its contents should be treated as historical material, not adjudicable instruments. The senior curator answered all of it without standing up. She was the oldest vestry I ever saw, her gray gone nearly white, her 4 eyes calm as a winter pond, and she spoke at the pace of someone who had outlived every clock in the building. Council proposes that the annex's rules were never harmonized with the modern code, she said. Council has it inverted. The modern code was never harmonized with the annex. The deposit rule is not an exception to your registry, advocate. Your registry is a convenience appended to the deposit rule. In any conflict between record and instrument, the instrument prevails. That sentence has been continuously in force for 10,000 years. If the Combine wished to litigate in a jurisdiction where it is not in force, the Combine should not have filed its claim with the Concord. A pause mild as milk. As for the junior registrar, the referral duty says directly, and he is the first officer in 9 centuries to perform it as written. The annex moves that his window seal be commended. Proceed. I watched Telex Sir, seated in the gallery in his dress grays, attempt to file that sentence somewhere in his own body and visibly fail. The transit hall, watching by pane, did not attempt anything of the kind. Hosk told me afterward you could hear Junction 3 from Junction 1. The key came up from custody in its sealed tray, and the chamber's assayers took it, 3 of them, of 3 different species. Because the bench was taking no chances of a partiality argument, and for 2 hours my grandfather's brass lay under instruments finer than anything that had ever touched it, while Sev stood ready at his rail, and I sat in the custodian's box with my hat on my knee and let them read my family like a core sample, metallurgy first. The brass was not Concord stock, not combined stock, not any registered station alloy. It was an archaic high-tin bronze with trace signatures of human smelting practice. Consistent, the assayer read the comparison plates aloud, with hull and fitting bronze of human first expansion colony vessels, type and service 85 to 100 years ago. The wear on the bow and teeth was mechanical, organic contact polish, decades deep, unfakeable by any accelerated process known to the bench. The stamped characters had been struck by hand with a worn letter punch, the strike's oxide layers aged in place. Struck, the assayer said, not less than 70 years ago, and the metal cut not less than 85. Which proves, Sev said, rising courteous as ever, the existence of an old human key. Esteemed adjudicators, my clients have never denied that humans pass through space, lose objects, and carry sentiment. An aged trinket stamped with characters of private meaning establishes a family's habit. It does not establish a settlement. The markings could designate anything, a shed, a strong box, a grave. Unless the bench proposes to take judicial notice of the contents of one human's pocket, there is nothing here but metal and nostalgia. The bench agrees, the presiding adjudicator said, and my chest went still, and she let it sit one full breath before finishing. Metal and nostalgia establish nothing alone. Curator, is the annex prepared? The annex has been prepared, the white curator said, for 90 years. They brought it in on a wheeled cradle because the deposit boxes of the founding era were cast alloy and built to outlast their civilizations, and the chamber rose without being asked, all of it bench, advocates, gallery, wardens. The way people rise in any culture when something very old comes through a door. The box was the gray of deep water, sealed in 3 places with the Concord's own Year 1 seals, and stenciled along its lid in the archaic script and in plain human letters beneath was the designation. SL7741K, Calder's Landing, Homestead Grant Charter Year 1. I had held its address in my pocket for 60 years. I stood in the custodian's box with my hat over my chest, and I watched 2 billion to 1 odds get wheeled across white stone in full sun, and I thought of my grandfather at 19 with a letter punch in his fist, working by lamplight in a shed that didn't have a door yet, making sure. The seals were assayed unbroken, Concord wax, Concord wire, untouched since the year of deposit, and no advocate alive could argue the Concord had forged its own 90-year-old seals in its own basement against its own interest. Then the senior curator broke them with a small ceremonial knife, in front of the bench, in front of the recording array, in front of the watching hall, and lifted out of the dark of that box the only thing it had ever held: paper. A single folded instrument of heavy colonial rag paper, gone the color of wheat, and even from the box I could see the strong black ink of the founding hand. The reader they appointed was neutral species, a skin archivist with white gloves, and the chamber heard the instrument of my world read aloud the way you'd hear a will read, every line landing on Sev's motion like soil on a coffin. Homestead Grant Charter of the Settlement of Calder's Landing, Calder's System, instantiated under Concord settlement law in the first year of landing. The founding census, 612 souls, listed by name, and the archivist read a sampling of names, and the 4th name read was Varga A., chainman, survey crew, and I did not make a sound, and it took everything I had ever learned on 3 worlds. The claims foundation, 1 survey benchmark, driven into bedrock above the South Valley, its datum recorded in full coordinates to the final digit. Assay the datum, the presiding adjudicator said, against the markings on the custodian's instrument. They projected the 2 side by side above the bench, 10 meters tall in the falling sun. The datum line from a paper charter sealed in the dark for 90 years, and the datum line my grandfather had hand-struck into hull bronze, letter by uneven letter, so his family would always be carrying the address of the truth, character for character, digit for digit, to the final digit, identical. The chamber did not erupt. That came later and elsewhere and in 9 scripts. What the chamber did was worse for the combine. It went absolutely silent, every eye of every species turning at once. Not to the bench, not to the instruments, but to Sev, with a single unanimous question that silence asked better than any tribunal. And Sev, advocate of the Rukith combine, polished as a boardroom table, looked up at the 2 matched lines of my family's handwriting blazing over the bench, and for the first and last time in the proceeding, had nothing whatsoever to file. Give the man his due, he tried. After a silence that the recording array would preserve forever at 11 full seconds, Sev rallied and fought a retreat that they should teach in whatever academy grows advocates from polished chitin. The match of datum lines, he proposed, established only that the key's maker had once seen the charter, perhaps a vault clerk, perhaps a thief. The combine moved for analysis of the charter's censuses against human genetic registries. The combine moved for a continuance pending investigation of the deep annex's chain of custody over, he managed to say with a level voice, the past 90 years. The bench let him finish. Courts that are about to rule against you always let you finish. It is the last full meal of procedure. Then the presiding adjudicator turned to her colleagues, and the 3 of them conferred for less time than it takes to fill out Form 77K, and she read the finding into the record while the sun came down through the crystal roof on all of us alike. The instrument prevails. The settlement of Calder's Landing was lawfully instantiated in Year 1, deposit sealed by the Concord's own hand, and continuously inhabited, the charter's named bloodlines being demonstrably extant, she said, in the person of the custodian of record currently seated in this chamber, whose family carried the designation of deposit for 3 generations as a domestic object. The registry entry was ordered restored in full effect retroactive to filing as if never suspended, 5 words that returned deeds, citizenships, births, and accounts to 40,000 people between one breath and the next. And then she kept reading, because the bench was not finished, and what followed was the part the combine had never put in any projection. The restored entry, being retroactive, rendered the combine's prior claim not merely defeated but impossible, a claim filed against a world that had at all times lawfully existed. Whereupon the tribunal was obliged to ask how 92 years of combine telemetry had come to exist, describing an unclaimed system. The bench's assayers had already pulled one of the belt beacons during the term, quietly, on a curator's motion I had known nothing about. Its memory cores carried lane protocol stamps from a revision of the Concord Transit Code. the adjudicator observed, that was 6 years old. 92 years of archive written in a dialect younger than Hosk's apron. The whole gleaming structure, beacons, salvage filings, mineral assays, decade renewals, every part of it had been manufactured by people who checked their history against the index, and only the index, because they could not imagine that anything outside the index could ever be consulted. They had erased my world through the registry, and the registry had been the only world they themselves ever lived in. The Combine's entire fraud was digitally instantiated, physically unverified. The chamber heard the bench hand the Combine its own weapon, grip first, and the referral for prosecution that followed named not only the filings but the relay corruption itself, and the courteous creature at the advocate's rail grew very still inside his polish, recalculating columns all the way down. I felt no triumph watching it. That surprised me. I had budgeted for triumph. What I felt was the thing you feel when a flooded river drops back inside its banks. Not victory, restoration. The land was simply there again, the way it had been all along, under the water of other people's paperwork. They returned the key in the chamber itself because the evidence code was satisfied, and because I suspect the white curator wanted it done in full sun and on the record. She carried the tray to the custodian's box herself, at the pace of someone who had outlived every clock in the building, and she did not hand me the key. She set the tray down and waited, so that the record would show the human taking back his own property with his own hand, owed to no one. "One question," she said, while my fingers closed on the worn brass and the weight of it went home into my palm like a joint resetting. Indulge an archivist. 2 billion instruments sleep in my annex, and the address of each one sleeps in the registry, and the registry we now find can be made to forget. Your species cut its address into a door key and handed it to its children. The annex wishes to know, is this a human institution? A law of yours? A doctrine? It's older than any of those, I said. It's a habit. We're a species that keeps things, curator. Keys, letters, seeds, graves. Any human will tell you a database is a kind of promise. And we've had 10,000 years of learning what gets done to promises that only live in one place. So we put the promise in our pockets, and we carry it, and we mostly forget why, until the one morning in 90 years when somebody at a counter asks us to prove the world exists. I turned the key once in the light the way I had at window 9 on the first day. A door is a promise you make to yourself that you're coming back. We just like to keep it where we can feel it. The curator's 4 pale eyes blinked. In sequence, slow, deliberate, which Tillicop told me afterward is the oldest courtesy a Vessery can pay. I have witnessed this myself. It does not require a file. The annex, she said, will open a standing reciprocal deposit intake for human sector worlds. We find your habit to be sound archival practice. The Earth convoy made send 6 days later, the Combine's routing objections having evaporated with their advocates standing, and I want to put on the record what my species actually sent, because the hall had spent a season asking when the human fleet would come, and now it came. And the transit hall stood at the eastern windows and watched it dock, and it was not warships. It was registry ships. 9 fat-bellied, slab-sided archive haulers with the Survey Service's plain gray livery, and out of them for 2 days came paper. Case after sealed case, duplicate charters, duplicate censuses, duplicate deeds and datums for every human settlement in the sector, hand-couriered by archivists in white gloves, walked down the concourse under guard and delivered into the deep annex's new human sector intake, while the curators stood receiving like family at a reunion. Earth had built the duplicates across 90 years of quiet, unglamorous institutional stubbornness, not because anyone had foreseen the Combine, but because keeping a second copy in a different place is the whole of human archival religion. Learn the way I told the curator we learn everything. The hard way, at the cost of libraries we still mourn by name. Mara Okafor walked off the first hauler in person. She found me at Hosk's stall, eating, and she stood looking at me for a moment, with the tiredness finally coming off her face like weather lifting. "Mr. Varga, you held the ground." "I had the deed in my pocket," I said. "Sit down, Consul, the kettle's famous." She sat. Hosk fed her. Around us the hall went on in 9 scripts, full of water sound and shutter light, and somewhere over our heads the panes were still rerunning the moment the datum lines matched, because the hall never tired of it, the gasp in every language at once. When the second line came up and the whole concourse had understood before any commentator spoke, the stranded man's pocket and the Concord's basement agreeing to the final digit, 90 years apart. "There's a clause you should know about," Okafor said, over the second bowl. "In the restoration order, retroactive as if never suspended, it reaches everything. Births, accounts, contracts." She let one beat pass, and a consular officer's beat is a precise instrument. "Your return passage on the Spindrift Lane, Mr. Varga, has been continuously valid for 117 days. The lane company owes you, by their own tariff, Miscarriage compensation at the daily rate. Compounding. I'm told their counsel went quite gray working it out. They've asked if you'd accept a settlement. I thought about it while the kettle sang. Tell them I'll take it in freight credit, I said. Whatever the figure comes to. There's about to be 90 years of deferred cargo moving between Earth and Calder's Landing, and I know a valley that needs a new seed drill, a schoolhouse roof, and 1,100 meters of irrigation pipe. A man shouldn't fly home rich through a hall full of stranded people. It spoils the homecoming. Okafor looked at me a long moment, and then she laughed. The first time I ever heard her do it, took out her pad, and filed it. Corin Mauve was reassigned before the convoy left. Not destroyed. I want to be exact because exactness is what I owe even him. He had broken no law, he had only used every law on me that would move, and the law, which cannot punish a man for that, did what institutions do instead. It read the record. The magistrate's stay, the commended referral he had tried to bury, the custody form with his own date on it that had saved me from his own removal order. The Concord transferred him to a survey of derelict registry stations on the far lanes. A posting, Tilek observed with no expression whatsoever, consisting almost entirely of unverified material. He came to window 9 on his last day in travel grays, no drone, no clerks. The hall watched him cross the whole 1,100 meters to my bench, and the hall let him. You are owed accuracy, he said. I reviewed your file the day you repaired the first fountain. I knew by the shutters what you would become to this hall, and I moved against you because a man who fixes what the authority abandons is a verdict on the authority, and I was the authority. His upper eyes held steady, the lower pair for once matched them. The verdict was correct. File that wherever humans file such things. We don't file it, I said. We just remember it. Travel safe, adjudicator. He stood a moment longer as if waiting for the rest of the sentence, the part with the knife in it. It never came. I was raised better than my luck. Then he inclined his narrow gray head exactly 1 degree and walked to his gate, and the blue light took him the way it takes everything, and I never saw him again. The restoration order reached the transit hall's machinery overnight, and I watched a bureaucracy work in the other direction for the first time, and I will testify that it is one of the genuinely beautiful sights of civilized space. Berths that had been void for a season revalidated in cascades down the departure panes. The ration counter's machine opened 940 subsidy lines in an hour, and the copper-feathered attendant pressed both hands flat on the counter and watched the approval scroll like a man watching rain end a drought. Accounts thawed, cargo holds unsealed. All across Concord space in 40 halls like mine, people of my world stood up off benches they had slept on for 100 days and walked to windows that finally had something to stamp. And at the Sen interchange, a contractor arrived, an actual, licensed, breathing maintenance contractor, summoned by an authority suddenly and intensely interested in the condition of a hall that 200 million beings had just watched on the panes. He found the fountains running, the shutters balanced, and the benches exceeding standard. I am told his report required a category that did not previously exist in the maintenance code. Repaired, attribution unverified. Tilek framed a copy. The Vesari do have humor. It is simply load-bearing. My own restamping I asked to have done at window 9, though by then the consulate could have handled it in the diplomatic ring with cushions and tea. Okafor understood without being told. Some paperwork is liturgy. I stood in the queue like anyone else on the morning of my 124th day, with my duffel on my shoulder and my tool roll under my arm. The hall pretended not to watch in 9 scripts and failed in all of them. When I reached the counter, Tilek Sir was at his station, narrow as a door, 4 amber eyes level, and between us on the counter lay my transit credential and the original berth chit for the Spindrift Lane, 124 days stale and by order of the bench, never invalid for a single hour of it. Elias Varga, he said, in his careful paper voice, exactly as he had on the first morning. Calder's Landing, I said. Human agricultural colony, Calder system. 90 years settled. He ran it. The terminal threw its answer up in cool blue glyphs, and he turned the display so I could read the translation strip, because the law says the traveler must be shown, and because he would not have skipped the step on his last morning at that window for anything either of our species owns. Origin verified. Entry resolves. Calder's Landing, registered year 1. Status, continuous, continuous. Of all the words their machine could have chosen. The stamp came down with the same sound it had made on the duty officer's form the first night. Knuckle on wood, but a door knocks the same sound. It closes with, and this time it was the other side of the door. Tilek slid the credential across the counter, and his hand stopped, and did not quite let go, and for a moment we held the same piece of paper, the gray clerk and the gray-headed man, on either side of the window that had defined us both. I have been promoted, he said. You will not have heard. The deep annex has requisitioned me. Curator track. I am to spend the next 40 years in a basement, certifying that things exist. His lower eyes blinked out of sequence one last time. It is the most coveted posting of my life, and it is your fault entirely. You knocked on their door with wax and paper, I said. I just carried brass. The habit was all yours, Tilek. Shall not may, he agreed and released the credential. And then he did something no Vesari does at a window, something I have never heard of one doing before or since. He stood up from his station, in uniform, on duty, in front of his queue and bowed, the full bow, the one they keep for the sealing of instruments. It is in the record of this authority, he said, loudly enough for the hall, that this man exists. I will not describe my voice for the next few seconds. There is no form for it. The goodbyes I made short, because the hall taught me how it says farewell, and the hall does not linger. People whose lives are made of departures learn to make the cut clean. Hosk fed me one last bowl and refused payment with his whole body, and pressed the kettle's little painted motto plate into my hands. The annex reminds all parties that retrieval is a physical process and will take the time it takes, and said only, in his bolder voice, for your kitchen wall, so you remember to be slow. The flower seller buried a cutting of her best stock in a sealed travel pot and told me it wanted poor soil and patience, and I said in that case it was going to the right valley. The cobbler's daughter took back the crate slat stool with great ceremony, sanded my name into the seat, and put it on display at the stall, where, for all I know, it is sitting yet. Then I walked to the gate the way I had walked to window 9 with the key, at the pace of a man going to church, and the Spindrift Lane took me 124 days late, 11 lanes, 4 transfers, every window resolving my origin on the first pass, which is a miracle no one ever notices until they have lived without it. I came down the shuttle ramp at Calder's Landing in the late afternoon of a 30-day summer, into a crowd I will not insult by counting, into wind that smelled of cut barley and rain on warm stone, on a world that had spent a season legally non-existent and had responded, being mine, by getting the harvest in anyway. The valley had organized the homecoming the way the hall had organized the hearing, quietly, completely, and before I knew I needed it. Somebody had my duffel out of my hands before the ramp ended. Somebody else had a flatbed waiting, but they had all, every one of them, left me the last 100 meters to do alone, because word of the whole story had run ahead of me down 90 years of party lines, and my neighbors are the kind of people who know exactly which parts of a man's business belong to the public record and which parts are sealed. The Ridge Road. The windbreak my father planted, taller than I remembered, his stone quiet in the shade of it. I stopped there long enough to say the things you say, and to set Hosk's motto plate against the base of the stone for a while, because he of all men would have wanted the joke explained, and I have never been able to leave a thing unexplained to him. Then down the lane between the fences I'd strung as a boy, through the gate that still dragged on its hinge, first item on a long list, to the house my grandfather raised. Timber frame gone silver, stone footing dark with the morning's rain, green roof you can see from the Ridge Road, and the door, the original lock. I stood on my own worn threshold stone, on the world I had spent 124 days proving, and I took out the key that had been the address of all of it, and my hand was steady, and I want that in the record too. The lock turned on the first try. 90 years of weather in that mechanism, 3 generations of hands, a season of non-existence, and the tumblers took the worn teeth the way the valley takes the river, like a thing that had never once, in all of it, doubted. A door is a promise you make to yourself that you're coming back. I went in, and I put the kettle on, and I let it be kept. There is not much more, and what there is the best part, so I will take my time with it the way Hosk taught me. The freight credit came through that winter, the Lane Company's council having gone, as promised, quite gray, and the valley got its irrigation pipe, its seed drill, and its schoolhouse roof, and I got the only payment I had wanted, which was to stand in the school door while the roof went on and listen to children conjugating verbs in a building that officially existed. The Colony Assembly voted 2 new customs into law that same season, both I'm told by acclamation and in under a minute first. Every door key cut on Calder's Landing, from that year forward, would be stamped with a deposit designation, as the founders' keys had been, no longer a family habit but a law of the world, so that no child of ours would ever again stand at a counter with the proof in his pocket and not know it. Second, the key of the Varga homestead was entered into the colonial register as a founding instrument, with a line appended in the registrar's hand that I did not request and will not have removed, currently in use. See front door. Earth, for its part, did the thing my species does when it has been badly frightened and proven right. It institutionalized the lesson so thoroughly that our grandchildren will groan about the paperwork. The Deep Annex's human sector intake became a treaty article. Reciprocal deposit returned to active law across the whole Concord, 40 species relearning in one season what they had filed away 10,000 years ago. And somewhere in the survey service, there is now a standing office whose entire mandate is the duplication, dispersal, and physical deposit of founding instruments, and whose unofficial motto, stitched on a banner I have seen with my own eyes in a photograph, is 5 words long. The instrument prevails. Carry copies. They offered to put my name on the office. I declined and suggested Tilleck's, and was informed that he had also declined and suggested mine, and that the office had resolved the standoff by naming itself after neither of us. Hanging in its entry hall a brass casting of a worn 3-toothed key 2 meters long, polished bright at the shank where 10,000 visiting archivists have not been able to stop themselves from touching it. 6 years passed. The gate got fixed and the hinge dragged again and got fixed again, which is the whole biography of every farm. The flower seller's cutting took to the poor soil of my dooryard with what I can only call vindictive enthusiasm, and blooms every 30-day summer in a color that has no name in our catalog, and my neighbors have stopped asking what it is and started asking for cuttings, which is how empires of the better kind begin. And on a morning in the 6th year, the relay in my kitchen chimed with a transit notice, origin Sen interchange, and a passenger manifest 1 line long. And I drove the flatbed 2 hours to the shuttle pad and stood at the foot of the ramp the way my father once stood waiting for me. He came down the ramp slowly, narrow as a door, gray gone a shade paler, in the deep charcoal wrap of a full curator of the deep annex, traveling, as he informed me before any greeting, because some beings lead with the part that matters, on the first recreational leave he had taken in his entire working life, having been advised by his physician, his section chief, and a consulting human archivist that the word sabbatical was not in fact a category error. Ilias Varga, Telexer said, at the bottom of the ramp, on the soil of Calder's Landing. I have processed the existence of 2 billion instruments. I have decided it was time to visit one. I took him home along the ridge road the long way, because the barley was in wind and there is no filing system in civilized space that prepares a Vesserai for what a valley of it does in late light, and he stood in the truck bed gripping the rail with both gray hands and said nothing for 11 kilometers, and his eyes were doing the slow sequential blink the whole way, which by then I knew for what it was. The oldest courtesy. Witnessed in person. No file required. At the house, I did not give him the tour. I gave him the door. He stood before it a long time, the silver timber, the stone footing, the iron lock my grandfather mortised in by lamplight before the colony had streets. And then he looked at me, and I took out the key, and I saw 4 amber eyes find the stamp designation along the shank like a pilgrim finding the right grave at last. SL7741K. The address of the truth, polished bright by 4 generations now. My grandniece had been carrying it to school for show and tell, with my blessing and a lanyard. You could let me file the moment, he said. The annex has a form for ceremonial witnessings. I wrote it myself. It is a very good form. I'm sure it is, I said, but you didn't cross 11 lanes for a form. No, said the curator of the deep annex, keeper of 2 billion sealed promises quietly in the late light of my dooryard. I came to see it open. So I put my grandfather's key into my grandfather's lock, on the world they said had never existed, and I turned it, and the tumblers took the worn teeth the way they always have, the way they always will, like the one record in all of civilized space that no one, anywhere has ever had to look up, and I opened my door, and I let my friend in.